One of the main turn-in-peace points of the war was Operation Barbarossa, Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, which was named for the medieval Roman emperor and launched on June 21st, 1941. Hitler sent his forces east in what would become an all-or-nothing campaign. Indeed, the fate of Germany, the Soviet Union, and Europe hung in the balance. More than 3 million German soldiers, 500,000 Axis troops, and hundreds of thousands of trucks, tanks, and horses crossed into Soviet territory in the largest invasion in world history. The operation was announced on national radio the following morning by Goebbels, who said, "At this moment, a march is taking place that, for its extent, compares with the greatest the world has ever seen. I have decided today to place the fate and future of the Reich and our people in the hands of our soldiers." The initial months of the operation went well for the Germans. They captured vast amounts of land and numerous cities along Russia's western border, while inflicting serious casualties on the outmatched Soviet forces. The numbers are without precedent in the annals of military history. More than 3 million Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner in 1941 alone, most of whom later perished from starvation, and millions more were killed in combat. Hitler confidently predicted the Soviet Union would fall within a few weeks. However, the German advance was about to be halted. It would then come completely unhinged when a mixture of impassably muddy roads, courtesy of Russia's inadequate infrastructure, and a rainy autumn, a bitterly cold winter, shortages of food and supplies, and Hitler's megalomania doomed the invasion. The powerful Nazi war machine was stopped just miles from Moscow by all these factors, and the Red Army's seemingly inexhaustible supply of men, which helped turn the tide of the invasion. In the single most deadly military operation in history, millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians were dead, but the Soviets held, and Germany never recovered. It would only get worse for the Nazi regime and the German people. Almost 1 year after the ill-fated invasion of the Soviet Union commenced, the director of the epic Nazi propaganda film, Herbert Selpin, was summoned to Berlin, where he was later found dead. The finished product was soon banned inside Germany. Meanwhile, the movie sets were removed, the actors and film crew headed back to Berlin to begin another propaganda project, and the grand film was largely forgotten, at least inside Germany. The Cap Arcona was relegated once again to the dull drudgery of housing German sailors on the Polish coast, just as it had done before being cast as the Titanic in the film. Captains and crews came and went, and the Cap Arcona rusted on the Polish coast from September 23rd, 1942, until March 1945. During the 2.5 years in dock, the ocean liner again fell into disrepair. But the star of the propaganda film was about to get another leading role. The reason? The war was getting even worse for Germany. Captain F. Seeger was forced to abandon his command by his crew on January 21st, 1943, whereupon First Officer G. Müller temporarily assumed control. Roughly 1 year later, Captain J. Goetz took command of the ship, followed by Captain H. Bertram, who took control on March 1st, 1945. By 1944, years of warfare had drained Germany's finances and the will of the populace, who had suffered through years of severe food and fuel rationing. Throughout the country, electricity and water systems no longer functioned, while in Hitler's Berlin residents queued for hours at food shops. The Nazi economy had collapsed, and the German people were reduced to scavenging for food. The Reichsmark was not worth the paper on which it was printed, and a crude system of barter had emerged whereby alcohol, cigarettes, and supplies were exchanged like currency. It had become difficult to travel anywhere inside Germany, whether by car, boat, train, or airplane. Fuel was scarce, and roads, bridges, and railways were destroyed. Perhaps the main deterrent to travel, however, was the constant bombing campaign by the Allies, which made it unsafe to leave one's home. Few cities in the country were safe from bombing. The Americans attacked by day, and British bombers came at night. Germany's air defences ceased to exist, yet the air raid sirens continued their eerie call, reminding Germans of the hopelessness of their situation. Both the western and the eastern fronts had collapsed. Indeed, the bloody but successful D-Day landing of the Allies at Normandy in June 1944 marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. By August, Allied forces had fought their way through France and had liberated Paris. The march to Berlin continued but was fraught with peril. One of the obstacles was the Siegfried Line. Germany's vaunted defensive line included hundreds of miles of tank traps, machine gun nests, mines, and other defensive measures organised to deny the Allies entrance to German soil. Like the Atlantic Wall on the European coast, it proved to be a formidable defensive network. Even though the wall and the line proved to be only temporary hurdles to the liberation of Europe, they did slow Allied gains and inflict many casualties. The result of the delay in the march to Berlin allowed the Russians to enter the important city first. Also, each day the Allied invasion was delayed meant more suffering in the concentration camps. The death toll of the Holocaust climbed as the Allies clawed their way across the continent. Every day mattered. One effort to subvert the Siegfried Line was Operation Market Garden, the largest airborne campaign at the time, overseen by British General Bernard Montgomery, and launched on September 17, 1944. But, tragically, it too stalled and caused further delays. General Dwight Eisenhower was hesitant to undertake an all-out offensive that would incur high casualties. Rather, he reluctantly opted for a more cautious strategy for getting to Berlin. Sure enough, on the other side of Berlin, the Soviets ended up suffering perhaps 300,000 casualties in the battle for the German capital. Another factor impacting the Allies' plans for invading Germany was the rumour that Hitler might retreat to Bavaria, the Austrian mountains at Tyrol near Innsbruck, or elsewhere to make a last stand. Reports suggested that his forces were stockpiling food and weapons in bunkers deep in the mountainous Austrian landscape. Other reports suggested that the Nazis planned to flee to Norway by way of the Baltic Sea in order to use the peninsula with its deep fjords and snowy peaks as a final redoubt. Either scenario would have resulted in the continuation of the war in terrain advantageous to the Nazis. Some Allied commanders advocated a lightning strike to prevent German forces and the Nazi command from escaping to Austria or Norway, but others favoured a more methodical approach in order to limit Allied casualties. As the debate raged over a strategy on how to get to Berlin, few military planners factored in the loss of prisoners inside Germany's concentration camps. But the Allied Bombing Command did make a decision that would soon have grave consequences for many prisoners inside the camps. For months, American and British aircraft had been conducting a savagely effective air campaign, bombing targets deeper and deeper into Germany. The British Air Chief, Sir Arthur Bomber Harris, hoped the bombing campaign would destroy the will of the German people and military to fight. Accordingly, the targets were not restricted to just military units and bases or trucks, trains, oil refineries, weapons factories, and industrial targets. They also targeted cities. On the evening of February 13th, 1945, nearly 800 Lancaster bombers of the Royal Air Force dropped thousands of tons of bombs in two massive attacks. The target was the historic city of Dresden in the far east of Germany, near the Czech and Polish borders. The following night, 301 American B-17 bombers from the 80 Air Corps hit the city again. The city was levelled, and countless civilians, Allied prisoners of war, and inmates who had the misfortune of being detained nearby in the concentration camp at Möllberg were killed. The day the bombings ended, a reporter at the Allied Expeditionary Force headquarters filed a dispatch claiming that he had been told that the Allies had adopted a deliberate terror campaign targeting German civilians with the goal of bringing about the end of the war. A month later, Prime Minister Winston Churchill signalled a shift in British policy when, on March 28th, he drafted a message for his senior staff that said, "It seems to me that the moment has come when the question of bombing of German cities simply for the sake of increasing the terror, though under other pretexts, should be reviewed." In part because of the controversy, the British command decided on April 16th, 1945, to formally end the widespread bombing of non-military targets. Churchill also shifted primary responsibility for targeting along Germany's northern and coastal airspace from bomber command to fighter command. The problem was that the latter did not have the intelligence or aerial reconnaissance capabilities that the bomber command enjoyed. Fighter command also lacked detailed data on the location of the concentration camps, an oversight that would, in a bizarre twist, soon jeopardize the Cap Arcona and thousands of prisoners. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat, as the Allies advanced from all directions into Germany and ultimately to Berlin. Some units fled back towards Berlin. The strict discipline that had defined the Nazi war machine was also in collapse, replaced by disarray and desertion among the troops and miscommunication at the top of the command structure. In Berlin, many soldiers lacked weapons or adequate ammunition for the defence of the capital city, while troops on the front lines found that their resupply lines had become non-existent. Exactly 3 years after Germany invaded Russia, Operation Bagration began, when 2 million Soviet troops counterattacked. By late August 1944, the Soviets had seized Bucharest. In September, they were in Estonia. That October, the Red Army marched through Belgrade. Later that same month, they entered German East Prussia and began a ruthless campaign, plundering villages and murdering civilians. One of the first German communities taken by the Red Army in 1944 was Nemmersdorf in the Gumbinnen district of East Prussia. Soviet troops set about brutalizing the population to the extent that any German villager shot outright was lucky. Women were raped by Soviet soldiers, and their naked bodies were left strewn about the ground, both as a warning to others and out of an utter disregard for humanity. Other victims were crucified or thrown into icy ponds and lakes to drown as a form of sport, while Russian soldiers callously wagered bets on the time it would take villagers to die. Other civilians suffered the fate of being tied down while Soviet tanks were driven over the bodies. One account of the Red Army's assault on the people of East Prussia recorded that children were shot indiscriminately, old men and boys castrated and their eyes gouged out before being killed or burned alive. Women were found nailed to barn doors after being stripped naked and gang-raped, their bodies then used for target practice. Another eyewitness described countless gruesome murders and Soviet soldiers dragging families out of their homes. Those not killed were never heard of again. Another account told of an elderly couple who were chased into the village pond and forced to stay there until they drowned in the icy waters. A man was hitched to a plough and driven until he keeled over, when a burst from a submachine gun finished him off. The proprietor of the Grumkau estate, Herr von Livonius, had his arms and legs hacked off and was thrown, still alive, to the pigs. It was payback time for Nazi aggression. As these stories spread, panic ensued in eastern Germany and Prussia. Many Germans rushed westward and to the south to surrender to American and British forces, rather than be caught on the Eastern Front. Others, fighting in East Prussia, committed self-inflicted wounds in hopes of being transferred back to Berlin. By 1945, entire communities were fleeing to the Baltic Sea to board ships headed out of Prussia and away from the Russians. The Allied advance on all fronts meant that concentration camps were liberated. On July 24, 1944, the Soviets arrived at Majdanek in Poland, the first concentration camp to fall into Allied hands. Like so many camps in Poland, Majdanek was unimaginably gruesome. As early as April 1942, the Schutzstaffel, SS, had killed 2,800 Jews there in one mass orgy of death. On November 3, 1943, a staggering 17,000 inmates were murdered, many with machine guns. Of the roughly 500,000 prisoners to arrive at or near Majdanek, about 200,000 of them died. Of those lost, roughly 125,000 were Jewish. The Soviets also liberated the notorious camp at Auschwitz on January 27, 1945. They found much of the camp destroyed and deserted, but there were still roughly 1,200 prisoners clinging to life. In haste, they had been abandoned as the Nazis fled the advancing Red Army. Just 2 weeks earlier, many of the prisoners were marched out of the camp in a last-minute effort to avoid their falling into Soviet hands. More than 1.5 million Jews had died at Auschwitz. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat, as the Allies advanced from all directions into Germany and ultimately to Berlin. Some units fled back toward Berlin. The strict discipline that had defined the Nazi war machine was also in collapse, replaced by disarray and desertion among the troops and miscommunication at the top of the command structure. In Berlin, many soldiers lacked weapons or adequate ammunition for the defence of the capital city, while troops on the front lines found that their resupply lines had become non-existent. Exactly 3 years after Germany invaded Russia, Operation Bagration began, when 2 million Soviet troops counter-attacked. By late August 1944, the Soviets had seized Bucharest. In September, they were in Estonia. That October, the Red Army marched through Belgrade. Later that same month, they entered German East Prussia and began a ruthless campaign, plundering villages and murdering civilians. One of the first German communities taken by the Red Army in 1944 was Nemmersdorf in the Gumbinnen district of East Prussia. Soviet troops set about brutalizing the population to the extent that any German villager shot outright was lucky. Women were raped by Soviet soldiers, and their naked bodies were left strewn about the ground, both as a warning to others and out of an utter disregard for humanity. Other victims were crucified or thrown into icy ponds and lakes to drown as a form of sport, while Russian soldiers callously wagered bets on the time it would take villagers to die. Other civilians suffered the fate of being tied down, while Soviet tanks were driven over the bodies. One account of the Red Army's assault on the people of East Prussia recorded that children were shot indiscriminately, old men and boys castrated, and their eyes gouged out before being killed or burned alive. Women were found nailed to barn doors after being stripped naked and gang-raped, their bodies then used for target practice. Another eyewitness described countless gruesome murders and Soviet soldiers dragging families out of their homes. Those not killed were never heard of again. Another account told of an elderly couple who were chased into the village pond and forced to stay there until they drowned in the icy waters. A man was hitched to a plough and driven until he keeled over when a burst from a submachine gun finished him off. The proprietor of the Grumko estate, Herr von Livonius, had his arms and legs hacked off and was thrown, still alive, to the pigs. It was payback time for Nazi aggression. As these stories spread, panic ensued in eastern Germany and Prussia. Many Germans rushed westward and to the south to surrender to American and British forces rather than be caught on the Eastern Front. Others, fighting in East Prussia, committed self-inflicted wounds in hopes of being transferred back to Berlin. By 1945, entire communities were fleeing to the Baltic Sea to board ships headed out of Prussia and away from the Russians. The Allied advance on all fronts meant that concentration camps were liberated. On July 24th, 1944, the Soviets arrived at Majdanek in Poland, the first concentration camp to fall into Allied hands. Like so many camps in Poland, Majdanek was unimaginably gruesome. As early as April 1942, the Schutzstaffel, SS, had killed 2,800 Jews there in one mass orgy of death. On November 3rd, 1943, a staggering 17,000 inmates were murdered, many with machine guns. Of the roughly 500,000 prisoners to arrive at or near Majdanek, about 200,000 of them died. Of those lost, roughly 125,000 were Jewish. The Soviets also liberated the notorious camp at Auschwitz on January 27, 1945. They have found much of the camp destroyed and deserted, but there were still roughly 200 prisoners clinging to life. In haste, they had been abandoned as the Nazis fled the advancing Red Army. Just 2 weeks earlier, many of the prisoners were marched out of the camp in a last-minute effort to avoid their falling into Soviet hands. More than 1.5 million Jews had died at Auschwitz. To make matters worse, some German units continued fighting and mounted spirited counter-offensives that stalled the Allied invasion. Throughout Nazi-occupied territories, partisans were murdered in alarming numbers in late 1944 and through the waning months of the war in 1945. Hitler also gave orders to shoot any officers who retreated, and the SS responded. At the same time, many of the young boys who were drafted to fight were quick to flee when the front lines collapsed. Any such soldier caught deserting was hanged with a sign around his neck reading, "I am a deserter. I was a coward in the face of the enemy." Every day and every delay by the Allies mattered. For the Allies, the final days of the war brought with them a series of questions and additional challenges beyond the obvious goal of destroying the last vestiges of Nazi resistance. Both sides were faced with the question of what to do about the concentration camps. For the Allies, the march to Berlin contained evidence of the shocking reality that the Nazis had established an extensive system of ruthless concentration camps and had murdered countless innocent people across the continent. The sheer number of camps and the inhuman conditions of them shocked even the most battle-tested soldiers. Most military units were unprepared to handle the conditions of the camps. It also became apparent to the Allied forces that there might still be hundreds of thousands of prisoners in concentration camps throughout Germany, Poland, and other Nazi-occupied areas not yet liberated. The march to Berlin meant that each victory and each liberated camp spared lives from the crematoriums. In February 1945, Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin met at Yalta on the shores of the Black Sea. After much wrangling, the Crimean Conference produced an agreement to conduct coordinated attacks on the remaining forces in Germany. The fate of countless Allied and German soldiers, as well as civilians inside Germany, also hung in the balance. Soon, the timing of the Allied march to Berlin would even matter for an old ocean liner. Recognizing the threat to soldiers and civilians in German-occupied territories, in late 1944, Admiral Karl Dönitz of the Kriegsmarine began planning for their evacuation. The situation further deteriorated when the Soviets entered Germany's eastern borders in January 1945. Germans were looking to get out of the region by any means necessary, but any escape by land for those trapped behind the rapidly advancing Red Army would now be impossible. The evacuation would have to be by sea. With limited warships available for the operation, Dönitz would end up relying on any available craft, including a few famous ocean liners. It would be perhaps the largest evacuation in history. Only a few years earlier, the Germans had driven the British Army off the continent, necessitating another massive naval rescue operation at Dunkirk. The date was May 26, 1940, and the war had come within a few miles of ending in a Nazi victory during the Battle of France. German forces were able to overrun France's border defences to the east, known as the Maginot Line, and also invade the Netherlands to the north. The lightning speed with which the Nazi war machine was able to accomplish these objectives caught the French, British, and Belgian armies by surprise. Allied counterattacks failed, and the tip of the German spear drove ever deeper through France and ultimately to the western edge of the continent. The result was that the Allied armies were separated and trapped in narrow corridors with their backs to the sea. With the Germans turning north and seizing port after port, there was little chance of reinforcement or rescue. The remaining Allied troops were surrounded and cut off from escape by land. However, with the war hanging in the balance, the Nazi command issued what history calls the Halt Order. The German advance stopped, allegedly in order to consolidate their forces before driving the British and French into the sea. This gave the British a brief window of opportunity to organise an escape. Churchill acted. Beginning on May 26th and lasting for 11 remarkable days, the Royal Navy sent every craft that would float to the French coast to evacuate the British and French forces. Roughly 338,000 men were saved, including 123,000 French soldiers. Even though the Allies suffered an embarrassing defeat, the armies lived to fight another day. the massive naval evacuation denied Hitler a quick and complete victory in the war. Allied casualties included approximately 11,000 dead and 40,000 captured, along with the loss of numerous tanks, artillery pieces, and trucks abandoned during the rushed evacuation. This time, it would be the Nazis who undertook a mass rescue operation for soldiers and civilians from conquered territories. It began in January and included civilians, members of the army, and SS officers and soldiers, many of whom had been living with their wives and children in confiscated homes in the occupied East. The effort was organised by Dönitz, and Vice Admiral Konrad Engelhardt has been called the greatest evacuation operation in history. In contrast to the British evacuation in the English Channel in 1940, the German evacuation of 1945 was launched from ports in the Baltic. Nearly 1 million Germans were able to board transport ships from the port of Danzig, headed to locations in the west such as Nazi-held Copenhagen. The operation also involved the port at nearby Gotenhafen, the site of present-day Gdynia on the Polish coast. It was the home port for two of Germany's celebrated ocean liners, the Cap Arcona and the Wilhelm Gustloff. Most of the fighting between the Germans and Russians during World War II occurred on land. However, there were critical naval campaigns, including the battle for the control of the Baltic. Germany had controlled the Baltic for much of the war, taking key ports such as Gotenhafen, where the final scenes of the Nazi propaganda film about the Titanic were shot. Kriegsmarine torpedo boats, warships, and U-boats were based there and patrolled the frigid waters for most of the war. The Allies prioritised other fronts during the war and made little progress. On the Baltic, because Hitler deployed thousands of mines in the sea, which also served to deny the Soviets the ability to move troops or conduct trade, and to bottle up the Soviet fleet in the Gulf of Finland. With control of the Baltic, Germany was able to supply and reinforce troops on the Eastern Front with relative ease. All that changed at the end of the war. By early 1945, the Kriegsmarine was broken, and Soviet submarines prowled the Baltic. Alerted to the massive evacuation from Gotenhafen and other locations, Soviet subs began hunting every German ship. One of them was the infamous Wilhelm Gustloff. With thousands of refugees crowded onto ports along the Baltic, Captain Friedrich Petersen of the Gustloff was ordered to pick up soldiers and civilians fleeing the Red Army and transport them to Kiel in the west, near the border with Denmark. The Gustloff was an unlikely transport craft. Much like the Cap Arcona, in its heyday it had been a grand liner. One of its famous cruises, which happened to be up the River Thames in April 1938, was even covered by media outlets across England and Germany. It was a favourite of many top Nazi officials, and had personally been inspected by Adolf Hitler, who proclaimed it one of the world's foremost ships. The liner was also part of the Strength Through Joy programme that provided German workers with inexpensive cruises and vacations. Measuring 684 feet in length and displacing nearly 26,000 tons, the Gustloff was equipped to carry 1,163 passengers. Built by Blohm plus Voss, the company responsible for the Cap Arcona, it was one of the largest ships assigned to evacuate the Eastern Front. The large white ship with one thick funnel was named for the 41-year-old former head of the Nazi Party in Switzerland, who happened to be a close friend and ardent supporter of Hitler. Gustloff was a controversial figure whose brutality led to his assassination in 1936. The man who pulled the trigger that ended Gustloff's life was David Frankfurter, a young Croatian Jew who had been studying dentistry in Germany but fled to Switzerland. The death of Gustloff at the hands of a Jew sent Hitler into a rage. Moreover, the details of the murder, Frankfurter had approached the Nazi leader at his home and shot him 5 times in the head, neck and chest in Gustloff's private study, provided fodder for propaganda. Hitler and Goebbels used the commemoration of Gustloff's death to ratchet up their vicious war against Europe's Jews. Goebbels orchestrated a highly public funeral for the fallen Nazi politician, held on February 12, 1936, and attended by a large cadre of Nazis, including Hitler and Goebbels. Heil Hitler salutes memorialized Gustloff, and the Führer announced to those in attendance that the murder was part of a larger Jewish plot against Germans, describing the hate-filled power of our Jewish foe, a foe to whom we had done no harm, but who nonetheless sought to subjugate our German people and make of it its slave, the foe who is responsible for all the misfortune that fell upon us in 1918, for all the misfortune which plagued Germany in the years that followed. After the funeral, Frankfurter was convicted of murder and sent to a prison in Switzerland. He served through the war, but was later pardoned, whereupon he moved to Israel, where he resided until his passing in 1982. In 1938, Hitler named a ship after his late friend. It was christened by Gustloff's widow in a highly propagandized ceremony. Since 1940, the Gustloff had been reassigned to Gotenhafen, where it functioned briefly as a hospital ship, and then served alongside its famous sister ship, Cap Arcona, as a U-boat training platform. Its demotion was viewed by some as proof the ship was cursed. After all, reasoned the crew, the Gustloff was named for a controversial slain leader, and its captain, Karl Lubbe, died of malaria on the bridge of the ship on the maiden voyage in 1938. Like the Cap Arcona, the Gustloff had fallen into disrepair while docked in Gotenhafen. The luxurious interior was stripped, the paint had chipped away, and the ship now carried anti-aircraft guns. In January 1945, in preparation for the massive evacuation mission, the ship's engines were repaired, and it was once again seaworthy. But nothing could have prepared the ship's crew for what lay in store for them. Panicked crowds of passengers were waiting for the Gustloff at Gotenhafen's port. People had come from miles around with little more than the clothing on their backs while fleeing certain and barbaric death at the hands of the Russians. Refugees were dying of hunger or disease while waiting to board the ship. News of the Soviet advance on the outskirts of the city only contributed to the anxiety most refugees felt. When it was finally time to board, thousands of refugees, suffering from freezing temperatures and little or no shelter, shoved and clawed their way onto the large liner. The ship was dangerously overcrowded. Passengers outnumbered life jackets and lifeboat capacity. Food and water were scarce, and toilets no longer worked. The smell caused even seasoned members of the crew to be sick to their stomachs. A few of the refugees, already weak and ill, died while the ship was still docked and preparing to sail. Yet, despite the conditions and a bitterly cold day in January, the ship held out hope of survival for the throngs of refugees pouring into the port. However, after accepting thousands of refugees, the crowded ship was forced to sit in port for 3 days on account of Soviet submarine activity throughout the southern Baltic. The British Royal Air Force was also now patrolling much of the Baltic, having sunk 18 German ships in these waters during the month of January alone. It was too dangerous to go to sea. Yet, as reports arrived of the progress made by the Soviet army marching toward Gotenhafen, it was clear that it was too dangerous to stay in port. Just as the ship was about to cast, off its lines and set sail, air raid sirens came screaming to life. Allied aircraft had been spotted in the skies above Gotenhafen. The order came down from the bridge. Everybody off! Passengers were hurried down the gangplanks. Others were too weak to stand, much less walk, and remained behind. It proved to be a false alarm. Ultimately, the passengers were reboarded, and the ship set a course for Mecklenburg and Kiel. It was its first voyage in roughly 4 years. It sailed at night along the Pomeranian coast in an attempt to elude submarines and warplanes that might be waiting deeper in the Baltic. As the ship travelled out of the bay and into the blackness of the Baltic on the freezing cold evening of January 30th, Captain Peterson ordered that a speech by Hitler be broadcast over the ship's intercom. The Führer was commemorating the occasion of his 12 years in power, but it is likely his words rang hollow to the refugees crammed onto the ship. The captain made another, more fateful order that evening. Due to the murky weather, he ordered the ship be illuminated to avoid a collision with another transport. Unknown to the crew and passengers, Lurking just below the water was a Soviet sub. It homed in on the brightly lit liner. Only minutes after Hitler's speech ended, the Gustloff was fired upon. 4 torpedoes were launched from the nearby Soviet submarine. 1 torpedo jammed in the launch tube, but the other 3 found their target on the starboard side of the ship. Freezing water rushed through the gaping holes in the hull of the liner. Already overcrowded, the ship immediately began listing. Most of the refugees were trapped below decks and at the waterline. They therefore had no chance. Many of those travelling in the deep holds of the ship died instantly. Those lucky enough to get to the top deck discovered several of the systems for deploying lifeboats had failed. Maintenance on the ship was long overdue. Others jumped or were knocked overboard into the freezing water, where they drowned or died within minutes from hypothermia. The Gustloff sank in under an hour. Because they were not far from the Polish coast, transport ships from a passing convoy would have been in a position to respond to the distressed ship. However, due to the risk of being torpedoed by the same sub, the large transport ships in the convoy abandoned the Gustloff. A few smaller craft did come to lend assistance to those who managed to make it into lifeboats. Roughly 900 people were saved, including the captain and 3 most senior officers, who chose not to assist their passengers, but an estimated 9,000 perished. Estimates of the tragedy vary because of the chaos surrounding the final months of the war and overcrowded conditions on board the ship. Death toll estimates vary from a low of 5,400 to a high of 9,400. One thing most scholars agree on is that many of those lost were women and children. Less than 2 weeks later, on February 10th, the 550-foot ship Baron von Steuben, named for the Prussian military officer who helped train the fledgling colonial army during the American Revolution, was torpedoed and sank while sailing from Gotenhafen to Copenhagen. It was hit with 2 torpedoes by the same submarine that attacked the Gustloff and sank in the same waters. Like the Gustloff, the Steuben was fleeing the advancing Red Army and transporting refugees. Also like its sister ship, the hospital ship had sailed only a few miles into the Baltic before being intercepted by a Soviet submarine. Nearly 3,000 wounded German soldiers and more than 1,100 civilian refugees from East Prussia filled the overcrowded decks, rooms and hallways. Built in 1922, it was a sturdy ship, but the torpedoes struck at an angle that caused the hull to split. The Steuben took fewer than 20 minutes to sink. Roughly 3,500 people were lost. Only 659 were rescued by passing transport ships, making the incident another one of the worst maritime disasters in history. An interesting note to this tragedy is that the Baron von Steuben was not discovered until 2005. The hull split, but resting on its side in 170 feet of water. The submarine that sank the Wilhelm Gustloff, Baron von Steuben, and many other vessels was the S-13, one of history's most feared and infamous submarines. It would later hunt the Cap Arcona. The sub was captained since 1942 by Alexander Marinesko, who was both a legend in the Soviet Navy and one of the more controversial figures of the war, on account of his ruthless attacks on civilian ships. Raised in Odessa by a Ukrainian mother and Russian father, Marinesko rose rapidly through the military ranks. Marinesko had been motivated to become a submariner by a fateful incident that had occurred back in 1939. It also involved a passenger ship and a submarine. The British liner SS Athenia was sailing in the Irish Sea, roughly 200 miles off the Welsh coast. Little did its captain or crew know, but it was being hunted by the Nazi submarine U-30, commanded by Fritz Julius Lemp. The British liner was carrying more than 1,400 passengers and crew, many of whom were Jewish refugees. Approximately 300 Americans were also on board. Although unprovoked, Lemp attacked and fired what were perhaps the first shots in what would become the Battle of the Atlantic. Roughly 120 people, including many women and children and 22 Americans, were killed in the surprise attack. It was the first British ship sunk by Germany in the war. Newspaper accounts in the United States and Europe expressed shock and condemnation at the attack, but the tragedy of the Athenia was soon forgotten, overshadowed by the Nazi invasion of Poland and start of the war, and thus largely forgotten by history. But it was not forgotten by Marinesco, who was both angered over the attack and intrigued by submarines. He decided to become a submarine commander and would end up being one of the most successful of the war. The sinking of the Athenia also caught the attention of Joseph Goebbels, who rewrote history with claims that the British sank their own ship in order to bring the United States into the war. With Marinsako's submarine being but one of many operating in the Baltic at the end of the war, it was a very dangerous place. Even though there were international agreements against targeting hospital ships and those on humanitarian missions, the Soviets, like the Nazis before them, actively hunted and destroyed them, ignoring international standards such as the Hague Convention, and often completing the attacks by shooting any survivors in the water or on lifeboats. In total, about 25,000 lives were lost during the evacuation from Prussia and eastern Germany, many of them on the Gustloff and Steuben. Several other German hospital and transport ships were lost, along with many warships and submarines. Despite the loss of ships and constant threat from Soviet submarines and British bombers, the evacuation continued through the winter. The name given to the massive evacuation was Operation Hannibal. It began in January with the knowledge that the approaching Red Army was unstoppable. In total, from January 23rd until May 8th, when the war ended, more than 800 ships evacuated a total of 2 million civilians and refugees, as well as 1 million soldiers from the advancing Red Army. With the war all but over and Germany in ruin, the Kriegsmarine still managed, in April 1945 alone, to evacuate 254,187 people. This feat was accomplished, even though the German army was nearly defeated. The command structure was largely hunkered down in Berlin, and the Allies had complete control of the skies above the Baltic. Indeed, Admiral Dönitz and Vice Admiral Engelhardt had to contend with limited resources. Germany was running out of fuel, ammunition, and ships, and the constant threat of naval and air attacks on their convoys. The admirals faced another problem. There were not enough ships. Because of severe shortages of coal, the Kriegsmarine was forced to conscript oil-burning ships, including several ocean liners, for the mission. As a result, in January 1945, after 3 years of serving as a floating barracks and naval training platform in Gotenhafen, the Cap Arcona was restored and reactivated for the operation. The interiors were stripped of any remaining furnishings in order to make room for additional refugees. The old ship was barely seaworthy, but the times were desperate for Germany. The ship was about to begin another intriguing role in its fascinating life. The mission: load refugees from the swelling population at Gotenhafen, and do so while the port was struggling with shortages of food and fuel, as well as riots sparked by the threat of the approaching Red Army. That done, the liner would transport the refugees to Denmark or other German-occupied areas, where they would be housed at temporary camps, hurriedly set up by the Nazi command. The empty ship would be refueled, if fuel was available, loaded with food, medicine, and supplies, and sent back for more refugees. Each crossing of the Baltic required the ship to navigate a gauntlet of Soviet submarines and British bombers. The Cap Arcona was now commanded by Johannes Gertz. On January 31st, it departed its berth in Gotenhafen, where the ship had been docked since November 29th, 1939. For the first run, the former luxury liner was overloaded with 10,000 refugees. During that initial evacuation across the Baltic, the Cap Arcona struck a Soviet mine. Luck was with the old liner, as damage was minimal, and although it was without any guns or defences, it managed to elude any warplanes and submarines. The Cap Arcona arrived in Copenhagen and unloaded its passengers. Captain Gertz and his crew were under tremendous stress during the crossing. All aboard knew the end was at hand for Germany. Passengers were starving and homeless. Most were sick, and several died during the voyage from a lack of food and water. Seeing so many desperate refugees, and hearing their stories of Russian atrocities on the Eastern Front, further unnerved even the hardiest of veteran sailors. While in port awaiting refueling and repairs, the captain was visited by Nazi officials and other ship commanders, all of whom shared similar stories of despair and rampant destruction in German cities. On February 20th, Goetz was visited in his cabin by a Captain Mender, whose team was inspecting the ship. Mender passed along the order that the Cap Arcona would again have to navigate Death Alley to pick up more refugees. The two officers also discussed the repairs needed for the ship. After the brief meeting, Mender put on his overcoat, holstered his duty weapon, and departed the cabin. Without warning, at around 10 that evening, Captain Goetz shot himself in the head. The ship's physician, Dr. Applebaum, was unable to revive him and pronounced his senior officer dead. Captain Goetz's body was removed from the ship at approximately 4:30 the following morning. The local Nazi police force boarded the ship and conducted an investigation of the shooting. Goetz had some minor health problems and was not a young man, but there were no plans to replace him and no reason to question his fitness for command. After interviewing the crew and Captain Mender, it was determined that there was no sign of foul play, and Goetz's death was declared to be a suicide brought on by intense depression over the stressful evacuation and the prospects of another dangerous trip across the Baltic. Goetz was replaced as captain on March 1st by Heinrich Bertram, commander of the Monte Rosa, another liner converted to function as a transport ship. Bertram, a stocky, square-jawed, experienced sailor, had previously served on the Cap Arcona from October 1933 to the spring of 1938 as second officer and later as first officer under Richard T. Near. Before the Cap Arcona could sail out of Copenhagen for another evacuation mission, however, its turbines and engines had to be overhauled. The ship was not in its prime and was showing signs of age and neglect. After the repairs, the liner undertook another round-trip crossing. Bertram sailed his ship at full speed in order for the Cap Arcona to outrun Soviet submarines that pursued it, which likely included Captain Marinziko's S-13. The ship completed the mission, but its engines, which had received only patchwork repairs, were again failing. It appeared that the once proud ocean liner would end its service in Copenhagen. However, Nazi officials wanted one of their largest ships back in service. Captain Bertram received an urgent radio message that another 300,000 refugees were waiting along the German and Polish coasts, and time was of the essence. A third mission was undertaken on March 27th. The Cap Arcona crossed the Baltic and was met in port by crowds of panicked civilians and wounded soldiers, who then clambered aboard, packing the ship far beyond its capacity. Hundreds of refugees were lined up on the decks, thousands were jammed into the holds, and hundreds more filled the Grand Salon. In total, the Cap Arcona picked up an additional 8,000 to 9,000 refugees and transported them back to Denmark, arriving on April 5th. However, it was no longer possible to sail into Gottenhafen or Danzig, as Soviet troops had seized the region, and submarines lay in wait for any German ships on that route. The Cap Arcona made a total of 3 harrowing round trips across the Baltic. An estimated 25,795 wounded soldiers, civilian refugees, and Nazi officials from East Prussia were safely evacuated by the liner from the advancing Red Army. Even though very few ports remained open for German shipping, Captain Bertram received a vague and cryptic order to report to Lübeck Bay at Neustadt in north-central Germany. On April 13th, the Cap Arcona made its last voyage. The former luxury liner arrived safely the next day, the turbines completely worn out. It was joined off the coast of Neustadt by 2 other ships, both of which had also helped to evacuate refugees across the Baltic: the Thielbeck, a 2,800 gross ton freighter, and the Deutschland, an ocean liner a bit smaller than the Cap Arcona. They anchored next to their sister ship, but the crews were unaware of the reason they were ordered to the bay. By the last winter of the war, most of the territory the Nazis had conquered in the preceding years was lost. The Soviets under Marshal Georgy Zhukov had counterattacked, pushing the Wehrmacht out of all of Eastern Europe. At the same time, the Americans had fought their way through Italy and were on Germany's southern border. Americans, British, Canadians, and others in the Allied Expeditionary Force, including Free French units, were now closing in from the lowlands to Germany's west. Allied soldiers were not the only ones preparing for the end of the war. SS Chief Heinrich Himmler understood that the war was lost. With the end at hand, Himmler, Goebbels, and Hitler were forced to address the fate of the concentration camps. What would happen if the free world learned the extent to which the Nazis operated concentration camps and the full horrors of their crematoriums? The prospects of millions of survivors telling graphically shocking stories was something fanatical Nazis could not allow to happen. Therefore, in March 1945, Hitler informed Himmler and Goebbels that they had to destroy the concentration camps and their inmates rather than allow them to fall into enemy hands. Himmler shared his fanatical vision with his Finnish massage therapist, Felix Kirsten, who recalled the words of the Nazi propagandist: "If the National Socialist Germany should fall, then our enemies, the traitors of the great Germanic idea, who were imprisoned in the concentration camps until now, should not witness the triumph of being a victor." Himmler promised that the prisoners won't witness this day, they will die with us all. This is the clear and logical order of our Führer, and I will make sure that it will be executed in all its accuracy and thoroughness. But Himmler had other plans for the prisoners. On March 19, 1945, Hitler dispatched one of his final official orders to his commanders to liquidate all evidence of the Holocaust. Camp commandants were told to destroy any indications which might have pointed to the existence of such installations, meaning everything from the camps and barracks to the poison gases and the prisoners themselves. As the man responsible for the administration of the Third Reich's concentration camps, Himmler released his own decree but waited to do so until April 14th. It read, "To all commanders of concentration camps, there will be no surrender. The camp has to be evacuated immediately. No prisoner may fall into the hands of the enemy alive." Even though the orders from Hitler were straightforward, Himmler complicated them by calling for prisoners to be evacuated rather than destroyed. As a result, some camp commandants believed they were ordered to kill all of their prisoners. Others interpreted the latter decree to mean that inmates were to be evacuated. If they were to be evacuated, commandants were not sure where to take the prisoners, at least initially. Nor did they know how prisoners were to be transferred. Questions remained as to whether prisoner relocation was the only option, or if commandants were able to decide whether to evacuate or conduct mass executions. Himmler's order did not directly affirm Hitler's dictate that all prisoners be eliminated, nor did it directly countermand it. Rather, the purpose for Himmler's vague decree was to provide him with cover in the event he needed prisoners alive as bargaining chips when negotiating with the Allies. His ambiguity also served to cloak his disloyalty and effort to save his own hide. By the last winter of the war, most of the territory the Nazis had conquered in the preceding years was lost. The Soviets under Marshal Georgy Zhukov had counterattacked, pushing the Wehrmacht out of all of Eastern Europe. At the same time, the Americans had fought their way through Italy and were on Germany's southern border. Americans, British, Canadians, and others in the Allied Expeditionary Force, including Free French units, were now closing in from the lowlands to Germany's west. Allied soldiers were not the only ones preparing for the end of the war. SS Chief Heinrich Himmler understood that the war was lost. With the end at hand, Himmler, Goebbels, and Hitler were forced to address the fate of the concentration camps. What would happen if the free world learned the extent to which the Nazis operated concentration camps and the full horrors of their crematoriums? The prospects of millions of survivors telling graphically shocking stories was something fanatical Nazis could not allow to happen. Therefore, in March 1945, Hitler informed Himmler and Goebbels that they had to destroy the concentration camps and their inmates rather than allow them to fall into enemy hands. Himmler shared his fanatical vision with his Finnish massage therapist, fiercest, who recalled the words of the Nazi propagandist: "If the National Socialist Germany should fall, then our enemies, the traitors of the great Germanic idea, who were imprisoned in the concentration camps until now, should not witness the triumph of being a victor. Himmler promised that the prisoners won't witness this day. They will die with us all. This is the clear and logical order of our Führer, and I will make sure that it will be executed in all its accuracy and thoroughness." But Himmler had other plans for the prisoners. On March 19, 1945, Hitler dispatched one of his final official orders to his commanders to liquidate all evidence of the Holocaust. Camp commandants were told to destroy any indications which might have pointed to the existence of such installations, meaning everything from the camps and barracks to the poison gases and the prisoners themselves. As the man responsible for the administration of the Third Reich's concentration camps, Himmler released his own decree, but waited to do so until April 14th. It read, "To all commanders of concentration camps, there will be no surrender. The camp has to be evacuated immediately. No prisoner may fall into the hands of the enemy alive." Even though the orders from Hitler were straightforward, Himmler complicated them by calling for prisoners to be evacuated, rather than destroyed. As a result, some camp commandants believed they were ordered to kill all of their prisoners. Others interpreted the latter decree to mean that inmates were to be evacuated. If they were to be evacuated, commandants were not sure where to take the prisoners, at least initially, nor did they know how prisoners were to be transferred. Questions remained as to whether prisoner relocation was the only option, or if commandants were able to decide whether to evacuate or conduct mass executions. Himmler's order did not directly affirm Hitler's dictate that all prisoners be eliminated, nor did it directly countermand it. Rather, the purpose for Himmler's vague decree was to provide him with cover in the event he needed prisoners alive as bargaining chips when negotiating with the Allies. His ambiguity also served to cloak his disloyalty and effort to save his own hide. The result of the issuance of two orders was that camp commandants responded with varying interpretations of the decrees. That spring, a group of concentration camp commanders met in haste in the Reich Security Office in Berlin to figure out what to do about the camps, prisoners, and their own survival. Evidence of the confusion and chaos in the Nazi command in the final months of the war is found in the trials at Nuremberg in 1945 and 1946. A Nazi official testifying at the trial of Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking SS officer to stand trial at Nuremberg, reported, "In the middle of April 1945, Gauleiter Giesler disclosed the fact to me that Obergruppenführer Kaltenbrunner had given him instructions, in accordance with an order from the Führer, that there should be made an immediate plan regarding the liquidation of the concentration camp at Dachau and the two Jewish work camps at Mühldorf and Landsberg. Other camps were later included on the list, including Neuengamme. As to how the camps were to be destroyed, the witness remembered that the instructions stated that the two Jewish work camps at Landsberg and Mühldorf were to be destroyed by the German Air Force, since the sites of these two camps had lately and repeatedly been affected by hostile bombing attacks. The Nazis would kill two birds with one stone, liquidate evidence of the Holocaust, and, if the deaths were discovered in these camps, blame Allied bombing. Apparently, the Luftwaffe either never received the order or was hesitant to comply with it. Ultimately, Hitler suggested that all inmates at Dachau, except Aryans from Britain and France, were to be killed by poison gas. Although the plan to destroy these particular camps never occurred, the general idea would resurface in the final days of the conflict at the Baltic. Amid the confusion, a cruel race for survival ensued. As the Allies marched into Germany, some Nazi commandants marched their prisoners out of the camps. However, even with the war lost, Allied forces closing in on them, and the Nazi dream destroyed, other fanatical commandants and guards executed their prisoners. Prisoners were gunned down by the thousands in the name of fulfilling Hitler's final solution. To save time, many of those shot were killed next to the mass graves that would soon hold their bodies. Other inmates were rushed wholesale into the ovens to be gassed. These executions were carried out day and night in hopes of eliminating all evidence of the atrocities. But, despite the brutal frenzy of mass murder in the final months of the war, the Nazis were unable to fully erase the record of their cruelty. When the British liberated Bergen-Belsen on April 15, 1945, they found 10,000 dead bodies in piles waiting to be buried. The prisoners had been murdered in a hurry, and not long before, the camp fell. The Nazis also failed to eradicate other evidence. This was the camp where Anne Frank had been clinging to life after having been brought there from Auschwitz. Records survived the war indicating that the young girl perished just a few weeks before the end of the war and what would have been her 16th birthday. The grisly scene at Bergen-Belsen was not the only alarming reality the liberators discovered. Another 40,000 prisoners were still alive, but close to death. Disturbingly, more than half of those liberated by the British would succumb to the trials of their internment only days or weeks after liberation. Other camp commandants had anticipated the end of the war and had been executing their prisoners since January and February. One such incident occurred at Ravensbrück, where thousands of female inmates were gassed in the early months of 1945. They too were only weeks away from liberation. Such barbarous acts continued literally to the bitter end. Thousands of prisoners were gassed at Sachsenhausen the day prior to the camp's liberation. At other concentration camps, Nazi officers and guards had dropped their weapons, shed their uniforms, and simply vacated the camps, presumably with the hope of blending in with local villagers. Many hoped to be captured by the Americans or British, who would feed and detain them according to international wartime agreements. The Germans did not want to be captured by Russian forces, who returned the Nazi brutality in kind. As a result, these concentration camps were abandoned, and the Allied soldiers liberating them encountered no opposition. Instead, what they witnessed upon arrival at the camps were ghastly mass graves, piles of bodies tossed about with no regard for human dignity, and a stench that moved many to spill the contents of their stomachs. Emaciated prisoners, more dead than alive after having been deprived every human necessity, simply sat waiting for them. They had nowhere else to go. Knowing the Allies were approaching, some guards, commandants, and others inside Nazi Germany tried to distance themselves from responsibility. One way to accomplish this was to release their prisoners, hoping to curry favour with the Allies or save their own lives by using the prisoners as bargaining chips when their camp was overrun by Allied forces. The unusual orders regarding the fate of the concentration camps were given by the same man charged with organising the camps and implementing Hitler's final solution, Heinrich Himmler. Like Joseph Goebbels, Himmler appears time and again in the story of the Cap Arcana and shaped the history that unfolded in May 1945. Himmler was born on October 7, 1900 in Munich to a conservative middle-class Catholic family. From an early age, he demonstrated some aptitude for learning and developed a knack for organisation and a temperament that craved strict routine and order, traits that later made him an effective Nazi administrator. As a teenager, Himmler was captivated by the Great War and longed to serve in uniform on the front lines. Consequently, on January 1, 1918, he withdrew from school and enlisted in the military. However, the young man was still completing his training when the war ended, and he would be denied the chance to serve his country. This missed opportunity would forever haunt him, causing him to overcompensate later in life when surrounded by fellow Nazi commanders who had been heroes of that war. Himmler's inability to serve left him deeply frustrated, but he remained exceedingly patriotic. He returned to school, completing a degree in agriculture from the Technical University in Munich in 1923. It was while he was back in school and brooding over Germany's misfortune that Himmler was exposed to the radical and hateful doctrines that would lead him to the Nazi cause. he joined a far-right student group and began consuming racialist and ultra-nationalist literature. Although Himmler was often described as resembling a mild-mannered schoolmaster, he would turn out to be anything but. That same year, while working in a demeaning job at a manure processing factory in Schleißheim, Himmler met Ernst Röhm, the head of a fledgling uber-nationalist political party. That impressionable young man was easily enticed to join Röhm in their infamous Beer Hall Putsch rally against the German government that would help thrust Adolf Hitler into the limelight. In 1928, Himmler married Margarete Boden. The couple had a daughter the next year. That same year marked his rise to power within the Nazi Party. On January 6, 1929, Hitler appointed Himmler to manage the party's newly created security service with the rank of Reichsführer. The little schoolmaster finally had an opportunity to serve his nation and avenge its defeat during World War I. When Hitler gained control of Germany in January 1933, he rewarded the loyal Himmler by making him the police chief of Munich. By the next year, Himmler controlled police and security services nationwide and began centralizing authority in the secret state police known as the Gestapo. During that same period of time, Hitler appointed Himmler to organize Nazi Party efforts to deal with the Jewish question. One of Himmler's main tasks in answering the Jewish question was to organize an extensive system of camps throughout Germany and Nazi-occupied territories. As chief of the SS, Himmler set about ruthlessly marginalizing groups such as gypsies, convicts, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Jews and others, all of whom he perceived to be both enemies of the Nazi state and threats to his theories on racial purity and superiority. He established offices and policies to purify the German stock and promote marriage among Aryans. Ironically, like Goebbels and other Nazi Party leaders, however, he would engage in extramarital affairs and, noticeably, looked nothing like the tall, strong, blonde, blue-eyed images of the Aryan Superman he advocated. His orders led to the mass evacuation of concentration camps in the waning weeks of the war. For the commandants of concentration camps, time was of the essence. The Allies were closing in. They had to decide whether to flee in an attempt to save their own hides, kill all prisoners in their camps in order to liquidate all evidence of their heinous crimes, or evacuate their prisoners before the camps were overrun by Allied forces. Relocation plans had been drafted in many camps, but were often derailed because of the rapid advance of Allied forces, the near-complete collapse of the Nazis' command and communication systems, and the limited availability of boats, trucks and trains for the relocation. But not everywhere. At Mittelbau-Dora, the prisoners were moved on April 10th. American soldiers arrived on April 11th to liberate the camp, only to discover that they were one day too late. The situation on the ground was dynamic and thoroughly unpredictable. As a result, some Nazi concentration camp commanders decided to force march their malnourished detainees out of the camps. If one of the prisoners struggled to keep up with the pace, he or she was killed while in transit. Indeed, there were many mass shootings along the roads leading out of the camps. Others perished from the long, forced marches in cold weather, the unhealthy conditions that existed in cattle cars crammed full of dying prisoners, and a critical shortage of food and water. As one scholar noted, the threats of exhaustion, malnutrition, pestilence, the influence of the weather, and deliberate exposure to enemy attacks proved to be far more effective and inconspicuous than the initial orders to liquidate the prisoners in the camps. Himmler's order to move the camp prisoners was received at Neuengamme in April by SS General Karl Totzauer, who passed it upward to the camp commandant. Commandant Max Pauli decided to comply with the order and immediately began preparations to abandon the camp. Neuengamme's prisoners would be marched or transported in the only direction not blocked by Allied forces, north. The destination, the Baltic coast, just over 60 miles away, graced with the strategic advantage of its bustling northern port, Neustadt had been one of the few German cities to recover from World War I and boast a strong economy. It was also one of the few cities not bombed during World War II. The Baltic coast thus provided the Germans with a possible means for escaping north to Norway by ship, and, most immediately, the only viable location for relocating prisoners from the concentration camps. Neuengamme was a massive camp with many subcamps which slowed the evacuation. The population at the camp had swelled. By the end of December 1944, roughly 10 to 15,000 prisoners remained at the main camp, with another 38,000 at Neuengamme's subcamps. Moving so many prisoners was a logistical nightmare, especially when it had to be done in a hurry, with few trucks, trains or ships available, and without support from the German command. Commandant Pauli's job was, ironically, made a little easier by the death rate at the camp. It is estimated that 1,700 prisoners were dying each month during the final winter of the war. Fully 2,500 died in February, but those still living were evacuated. Prisoners at Neuengamme near Hamburg, along with those from Mittelbau-Dora at Nordhausen and Stutthof by Danzig, were among those being marched to the Baltic. A long, straggling line of death composed mostly of Jews and captured Russian soldiers marched wearily northward. Unbeknownst to them, the British military was also closing in on the Baltic coast. Also, unknown to the prisoners trekking or being transported north from Neuengamme, 4 large ships were awaiting them in the southern Baltic port at Lübeck Bay. In fact, not even Pauli and the other camp commandants knew their prisoners would soon be loaded on the ocean liners. The fateful decisions about what to do with the prisoners once they arrived at the Baltic were still being debated in part because of Himmler's ongoing plans to negotiate a separate surrender, and in part because of questions about what to do with Germany's ocean liners and freighters now that the war was all but over. Some Nazi commanders did not want to see their ships confiscated by their allies as war reparations, as had happened after World War I. They advocated sinking all German ships. At the same time, German shipping companies hoped the Allies would allow them to keep their investments and continue business operations after the war ended. Such issues were complicated by the fact that the Kriegsmarine had a shipping control authority called the Kriegsmarine-Dienststellen. The KMD was responsible for coordinating wartime merchant marine shipping and transport. The merchant marine had been a somewhat independent authority, but in 1944 Admiral Karl Dönitz placed it under the control of a new agency called the Citra. This end caused obvious strain on account of their conflicting goals and interwoven chains of command. Officers were uncertain as to whether the Cap Arcona should be classified as a merchant ship or military craft. There was confusion as to which command the former liner should report. It was the Citra that had ordered the Cap Arcona and other ocean liners to rescue tens of thousands of refugees from besieged German ports during Operation Hannibal. After completing its last daring run across the Baltic on March 30th, the Cap Arcona was in bad shape. Its turbines were worn out and it was overdue for maintenance. The Citra thus released the ship from its control. Now decommissioned, the Cap Arcona was returned to the Hamburg Süd Company, which operated the liner before the war. The company was eager to save the big ocean liner for their post-war business plans. However, General Karl Kaufmann, the provincial governor A of Hamburg, ordered the ship to dock at Neustadt Bay, which was near his office at Lübeck Bay, and, he claimed, was therefore within his jurisdiction. Born on October 10, 1900, in Krefeld, the governor had been a founding member of the Nazi Party in 1921 and quickly became one of Hitler's favourite officers. Hitler appointed Kaufmann governor of the Gauss Rhineland and Ruhr in the 1920s, and then head of the Nazi Party and governor of Hamburg. Kaufmann served in that position from 1929 to the end of the war, governing with an iron fist. In Nazi Germany, the title was Gauleiter. Kaufmann expanded his base of power in Hamburg and the surrounding region by assuming a number of other commands, including as the Reich Commissioner for Shipping. In this capacity, he claimed to be in charge of home defence and all shipping in northern Germany. Not the Citra, or KMD. It remains uncertain as to whether Nazi commanders intended to destroy all German ships before the Allies could seize them or wanted to return them to the German shipping companies, just as it was unclear who inside Germany had the authority to decide other than Hitler. Kaufmann seized control and ordered 4 large ships: the Athene, Deutschland, Thielbeck, whose steering system was barely working after having been bombed the previous summer, and Cap Arcona, to steam to Lübeck Bay in April 1945. Heinrich Bertram, the captain of the Cap Arcona, reluctantly ordered his ship back into service and sailed it from Denmark to the bay just off the coast of Neustadt and Lübeck, where it arrived on April 14th. The 2 big liners, the Cap Arcona and Deutschland, anchored 2 miles off the coast, while the 2 smaller freighters, the Athene and Thielbeck, were tethered to the docks. Even though all 4 of the ships were damaged and badly in need of repairs, Kaufmann ordered the ships' captains to prepare to receive prisoners marching north from Neuengamme,